Well, you know what? We'll have, when we start this, we will have 3 hours and 46 minutes.
Well, what sort of questions did you have? I mean, Dick mentioned you had some specific questions that I might be able to help with.
Well, really, I'm very interested in getting John to talk, as he started to talk about your, your own background and that, you're coming to this country and some of the interesting people you've known.
Okay. Well.
So let me just say, so that we know, I'm here and honored to be interviewing Dr. John Lowenfeld, and he's been in practice for how many years as a psychologist?
Well, I got my degree in 1955.
Okay.
I've been working as a psychologist ever since.
Continues to practice.
Yeah.
And has some wonderful stories for us, and has very interesting beginnings.
Yeah. I got my degree at Penn State, and I studied under Bernreuther and Bill Snyder, who eventually wound up at Ohio U, and George Guthrie, who was a roommate of Paul Meals, I think, and
We had one of his textbooks in graduate
Bill Snyder
school.
was a student of Carl Rogers, and so the clinic at Penn State was very Rogerian.
And what was that like?
We had to record all our psychotherapy sessions, and they all went to Bill Snyder. He marked everything according to what sort of a response it was, whether it was reflection of feeling or interpretation, God forbid, and things like that. And it was really very intense. It was a good therapy experience. But then when I went on my internship in Indiana, we were 50 miles from Chicago, and our consultants were all from the Chicago Institute of Psychoanalysis. So everything was analytic at that place. So I got a good background in analytic work as well as Rogerian, and now I'm much more behavioral than anything else, cognitive.
Mm-hmm.
Which my work at Penn State laid the groundwork for, because Penn State was a very heavily experimental school.
Okay.
We used to tease the residents who wore white coats. The only people at Penn State who wore white coats were the people who cleaned out the rat cages.
That's a good one.
Getting back to what we were talking about before, when we came to the United States, my father was in art education. And,
why don't you start at the very beginning, because I didn't get that on tape. So
Okay.
you were born in Austria.
I was born in Austria.
Mm-hmm.
In 1938, Hitler came into Austria in March. We were able to escape in November. There was a time when we were hiding in a friend's photographic darkroom while the Nazis were searching the house. It was a turbulent time. I was just a child. I was sheltered from most of the anxiety of that period.
Really? How old were you when you were hiding in the dark room?
7.
7. Okay. Oh boy.
And so I had just started second grade, and the woman who was the director of that Montessori school was a woman named Nushi Planck. And as it turned out later, this is Dick knows the history of this. Her husband, Robert Planck, and they escaped from Austria as well.
Okay.
Her husband was a social worker at the VA in Cleveland.
Oh.
And I got back somehow in touch with them. This is a convoluted story. I got back in touch with them through Robert, her husband,
Mm-hmm.
who went to a conference with me in the VA. We had a conference in Lexington, Kentucky on existential psychology or phenomenology. And he went and I went, and I noticed his accent, and I asked him, and it turned out that he was a friend of my grandfather, a personal friend of my grandfather's.
Oh my.
And his wife was the directress of the school where I started my elementary education. So we got together again and met there.
Huh.
It turned out that there was another student who was also a classmate of mine named Felix Krauss, who was a principal oboe in the Cleveland Orchestra.
Hmm.
And it turned out that his wife, and I didn't know this at the time, but my son, Robin, took cello lessons from a woman named Marcia Krauss, who was his wife. And I didn't know
the
this
connection.
relationship at the time that my son was taking cello lessons.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And Dick knows, or knew Robert through, I guess, the VA.
He was my mentor for group therapy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, this
That's
whole
wonderful.
Viennese group somehow met in Cleveland again, which is and purely coincidental. I mean,
Were there more Viennese people who settled in Cleveland?
no.
Okay.
As far as I know,
Interesting.
those are the only ones that I'm aware of.
Okay. Well, that must have been really incredible to reconnect after all those times.
Also connected in this respect was my first grade teacher in the same Montessori school,
Mm-hmm.
whose name was Trude Weinfeld, and she eventually married Bruno Bettelheim.
Oh my. Okay.
So.
And were you able to meet Bruno Bettelheim?
No,
or?
I never met Bruno.
Okay.
No.
Very interesting.
I did meet Carl Rogers.
What did you think of Carl Rogers? What was your impression of when you met him?
You know, as much as his therapies depends on reflection of feeling and understanding feelings and so on, I found him to be kind of dry. Interesting, personable, but dry.
That's very interesting. So your family came to the United States from Austria?
My father had written a book in Austria, and it had been translated into English and published in England, and my parents were able to prevail on the publishers to hold the royalties, so that when we got to England, which we did eventually, there was a little money waiting,
Mm-hmm.
and then we were able to emigrate to the United States after a couple of months in England. that was mostly through the efforts of Gordon Allport,
Hmm.
who had known of my father's work and helped him to find a position first at Harvard and then in Virginia. My dad was director of the art education department in a small school, at that time small, in Virginia, Hampton. Now it's Hampton University. And we were there for about 7 years, and then my father was appointed chair of the art ed department at Penn State, and that's how I got my education, as a fringe benefit for his employment.
How fortunate.
Yes. Yeah, we certainly didn't have much in the way of funds.
And Gordon Allport, if I remember correctly, isn't he a psychologist?
Oh, yes.
As well? Yeah.
Psychology of rumor.
Yeah. Okay. And how did your father's work and his practice
I'm not sure
overlap?
exactly. My father's work was mostly in creativity,
Okay.
and Allport was a social psychologist and was interested in those kinds of processes. There were some interesting things that went on at Penn State. It became the center for work in creativity in art education. And J.P. Guilford was doing similar work in creativity and the sciences and psychology in California. And they did parallel research. And when they finally got together, they found that they had identified exactly the same factors in creativity, in the arts, and in the sciences, which was an interesting finding. It was unique at the time.
Yes. And so what inspired you in the direction of psychology?
I had a case of hero worship on a friend of my father's who was in sociology. And I started out in sociology at Penn State. And I found that it was too general, dealt with groups and not individuals so much. And then I had a psychology professor for my introductory psych courses, a chap named J.E. DeCamp. And he was fascinating and taught very well with humor. And I switched my major my second semester in psychology.
Good choice.
I hadn't a clue what I was getting into. I mean, at that time, psychologists were pretty much psychometrists.
Ah, okay.
Mostly what we did was testing. People like Rogers were beginning to do things with therapy, but not. That psychologists weren't employed as psychotherapists.
Mm-hmm.
That was still in part of medicine.
That's interesting.
And so mostly when we were employed as psychologists, mostly what we did was assessment. Every once in a while, somebody would refer someone as a therapy patient in a hospital, but not all that often. When I did when I got my boards, the American Board of Professional Psychology, the case presentation that I had was a patient that I had been working with for about a year at Cleveland Psychiatric Institute. But I didn't have very many patients like that.
Okay. And how, I'm imagining it must have been early in the years of the ABEP process. I mean,
that was in 1962. Yeah.
okay. Okay.
ABEP, I think, was established about 47,
Oh, okay. Okay.
but I may be mistaken about that, but I think that's it. And but psychology was very small when I started.
Mm-hmm.
At the American Psychological Association had one of their annual meetings at Penn State, and they put them all up in the girls' dorm. The entire membership.
Wow.
The entire membership was 3,000 people.
Wow. Wow. And so you went from Penn State to Chicago for your
I went to
internship.
from Penn State. No, I did my internship in one of the Indiana state hospitals, but it was 50 miles from Chicago, and so that's where our
Okay.
consultants came from.
I see. Okay. Okay. And where did you go after your internship?
My first job was in Larned, Kansas, at a state hospital, good one, and that was an interesting experience. When I was on my internship at the state hospital in Indiana, that was before any of the psychiatric drugs, before Thorazine, before anything. The treatment methods were electric shock, insulin shock, and metrazole, and needle sprays and cold packs and that sort of thing. Then I went back to Penn State for a year, finished my dissertation, got my degree in '55. It was my internship was '53 to '54.
Okay.
When I graduated, I took the first job that I could find, which was in Larned, Kansas, and I took it because it was the highest paying that was offered, and I was about to be drafted. And I had a wife and child by that time, and I figured I needed to accumulate as much cash as I could before I was drafted.
Okay.
As it turned out, I had applied for a commission in public health service, and the commission came through a week before I was to report for my draft physical. And so the next 2 years I spent in Denver as an officer in public health service assigned to a federal correctional institution. And from there I came to Cleveland, to Cleveland Psychiatric Institute, and I was there for 3 years. And then in 1961, when they opened up the Brecksville VA hospital, I started work there. And I was there until, no, it was 1958 that I came to Cleveland Psychiatric Institute. And in '61, I started work at the VA.
Okay.
And I was there until I retired in 1990.
And the Brecksville VA
And I probably did everything at Brecksville that could be done. I was on the ward as a psychologist. I was director of clinical training for a number of years. I was assistant chief for a number of years. And I think I served on every single unit that there was. And then I retired in 1990. Went into a private practice with a former student who invited me into the practice that they had established. And that didn't work out very well for a number of reasons. But I switched from that into Dick's practice. Dick was good enough to invite me. I was there since 1993.
Wow.
I've been there ever since. I'm still there for part-time.
Fantastic. And I understand that they seek you out for wise counsel, so they're thankful to have you.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And so it sounds like your career mirrored what was happening within the profession in terms of shifting from psychometrics to
assessment to. See, I did not do a VA internship, but I had the public health service experience, so I had a long period of time with the federal government.
Okay.
Which was a good thing. I mean, that's what I depend on now for my pension.
That is a good thing. And so...
I was in private practice of my own in Brecksville all the time that I was at the VA. I put my kids through school with that.
And what sort of practice did you have in Brecksville?
It was a small evening practice. I'd see 3 patients in an evening. And it was a single therapy room and a waiting room and a restroom. That was about it. Actually, when I joined the practice with Dick, eventually I turned that over to Dick's practice, and Dick's practice outgrew it very quickly and moved to a different place, and they still have an office in Brecksville.
Uh-huh. Very nice. Very nice. And so at what point did you become involved with the Ohio Psychological Association?
You know, I was trying to remember what year. I think it must have been about 1959 or 60.
Okay. Okay.
I was one of the psychologists that was certified by OPA before we had licensing.
Ah.
I found my diploma from that, or certificate from that.
Oh, that's interesting. And what was that process like to shift over from being certified by OPA to the formal licensing?
Well, the OPA had a system of certification, but it was voluntary.
Oh.
I mean, there was no law that said you had to be certified. But those people who chose to submit themselves to examination could get a certificate, and quite a few did. Mine is dated, I have it over here some on the table. It's dated 66 and was certificate number 400.
Wow. I had no idea that
And
OPA
eventually
did that
I was
before.
one of the examiners for OPA on that group before licensing.
Mm-hmm. How did you like that?
It was fun.
Were you able to certify anybody who's now doing amazing things?
Oh my. I couldn't tell you.
And so when people started talking about licensing, mandated licensing, what were your thoughts about that idea?
Oh, we worked pretty hard to get it done.
Okay. That was yeah.
I have a certificate of recognition from OPA in, I think in 72, which is the licensing went into effect in 72 or 73.
Mm-hmm.
And it was for my work in helping to get the licensing going.
Now, you mentioned also that you were part of the committee that had worked with the Ohio legislature
with a professional school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm real proud of that. For a number of years after the professional school was established, I always received an invitation to their graduation exercises as an honorific.
Oh,
I mean,
that's wonderful. And having been a beneficiary of that, I went to that school from 84 to 88, and Ron Fox was the dean at the time, and it was an amazing experience.
there must be records somewhere of the Academy for Education and Research in Professional Psychology. I have the certificate if you want to see it.
Sure, when we're done with this,
Sure.
we can. That's wonderful. And so, who all served on that committee with you?
Well, Jim Webb, Dave Rogers, Charles Hunter, I think Gary Donelski was on it. Damned if I remember everyone.
That sounds like that would have been a fun group of people to serve with.
Yeah.
Any wild and crazy stories of
Well,
happy reminiscences of that
no, but I
process?
have one about Henry Seaman.
Uh-huh.
We had an OPA convention in Perrysburg in I forget what year, early on.
Uh-huh.
And they had a swimming pool that went from inside to outside. You could go through a kind of a curtain and swim outside. And so a number of us who put up at the motel there, and I think it was a Holiday Inn, I'm not sure, we went swimming. And Henry had forgotten a swimsuit. So he put on a pair of brief shorts, undershorts, and another one backwards to be sure nothing fell out, and went swimming.
That's a great story. Oh, that's good.
He was a sight to behold.
Oh, and at that time, was he the executive director of OPA?
Yes.
Okay. So the guy in the funny-looking swim trunks. Oh, that's good.
Henry was very effective with the state legislature in helping to get all kinds of things going.
What sorts of things do you remember him?
Well, with
Getting
the
going.
professional school,
Okay.
and with the licensing, and with
And he was executive director for many years.
many years, yeah. Ming Fisher was
Yes.
on the. No, I can't remember how that worked out. I think she was involved with the voluntary certification with OPA, and then eventually became. I'm not sure what her title was, but she made the licensing board work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she did that for many years.
So she was, from the beginning of the time of licensing,
Yeah.
it sounds like she was involved. That's very interesting. So do you have any favorite periods of practice, of psychology, of anything that just was a really exciting time for you or interesting time for you?
I think I've liked best the private practice that I've been doing with Dick's group. It's
nice.
varied. At the VA we saw mostly males,
Mm-hmm.
occasionally family, but mostly men. Very few women veterans at the time I was at the VA. I enjoyed the training. I was director of clinical training at the VA for some time.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, I got the program APA approved at the VA.
Good for you.
But and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed working with the students. But in terms of actual practice, I think I've enjoyed my work at Western Reserve Psychological Associates as much as anything I've done.
That's wonderful. And how nice that is what you've been able to do once you've retired, so you could...
Well, it's almost been like a second career. I mean, 93, it's been what,
17 years?
17.
many years, yeah.
Fantastic.
I should interject that sometimes I have to cover for you when you're away, and as is typical, patients are ready to go back to him quickly. And
They miss him.
one of the patients said recently, while you were out and I was seeing her, "You are no Dr. Lowenfeld." She was much relieved when you came back.
It's good to know that.
Going back to something you had said about that period early in your training and practice, when we didn't have psychotropic medications and you were working in those...
I guess I never followed up on that. When I took my first job in Kansas
Mm-hmm.
in 1955,
Mm-hmm.
Thorazine had hit the market.
Ah.
And it was an entirely different scene. And patients were no longer screaming and yelling and being packed in cold sheets and needle sprays and what have you. I mean, I remember electric shock. People used to be in beds and the shock machine would go from one bed to the next, and there was no anesthesia, there was no privacy, it was bedlam.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started working after my degree, people were walking around like zombies, but they weren't screaming anymore.
Wow. And then we went from, people being treated in state hospitals and county farm kinds of situations to, in the 60s, you probably would have been in Cleveland around that time, where...
In Cleveland from 58 to 61 at the Psychiatric Institute.
Mm-hmm.
But there were myths floating around all during the 60s. I mean, it's like Thorazine was for hallucinations and Stelazine was for delusions, which has no basis in fact.
Mm-hmm.
But it was common practice.
Mm. Interesting.
I mean, residents were taught that.
Interesting. And then there was a movement toward the county, or living in the community
Yeah.
And what impact did that have on your practice with veterans during that
Not
time?
much.
Okay.
No. The VA was pretty much immune from that.
Okay.
The state hospitals got emptied out, but the VA was not.
Okay.
Now the VA has, I understand, has recently been subject to that. They closed Brecksville, and they've established a lot of outpatient clinics. So I think there's some push to get people into the community. But it sounds to me as if the VA is doing it right,
Good.
because they're establishing the outpatient clinics. When the state emptied out the hospitals, they didn't establish anything.
They just dropped them. Now, in your various positions at the VA, I would imagine that you were also on the forefront of, you talk about residents at one point thinking that stelazine and thorazine were for different aspects, and
Well, we worked a lot with the physicians at the VA. Some were psychiatrists, most were general practice physicians working in psychiatry. It was my impression that medicine was the weakest link in the VA professional staff. When I started at the VA, mostly they were Eastern European physicians and a number of Filipino physicians, and very few American-trained people.
Interesting. And then were you at the VA when psychologists began to be certified, I guess, to
Yeah,
prescribe?
Psychology at the VA was, I think, probably as advanced as psychology anywhere. I mean, we had our battles. Our chief of psychology was in constant conflict with the chief of psychiatry, who was Ukrainian. That's a story in and of itself, telling war stories. But they were in such conflict that commissions came from Washington to check out what was going on here. And as a consequence, the chief of psychiatry was given a choice of being transferred or leaving.
Ah.
And he left.
And was that over a certain point of practice for psychology? Or
I'm
just
sorry?
was that over a certain point of practice of psychology, or just in general?
It was constant conflict.
Oh, okay.
Dick knows about that.
Yeah, he tried to fire me because I disagreed with him.
Oh.
He was a real autocrat. Got his degree in psychiatry in Germany during the Second World War, under the Nazis.
Interesting.
John,
It
you
was all some of us could do to keep from strangling him.
It sounds like it.
John, you may recall that he would tell the trainees how he learned psychoanalysis, and that he read Fenchel. He would read a page a day and memorize it. And that's how he learned his psychiatry.
Yeah.
And 3 times he failed
His boards.
His boards.
Yeah. Amazing man.
Do you know where he went? Do you know where he went after he left Cleveland?
He went into private practice in Parma.
Okay.
John, I heard that he was offered a transfer to someplace in North Dakota.
That's what I understand. He was offered chief of psychiatry in someplace in North Dakota or he could leave.
Wow. Okay.
And he chose to leave.
So I'm wondering, Dick, if there are things that Dr. Lowenfeld has not mentioned that you've heard stories of that you think would be nice for him.
Yeah, perhaps you could tell us a bit about Margarita Hertz, who had an office near you at CPI.
Oh, she was a character. She impressed most people as being quite arrogant and opinionated, and she knew a great deal about Rorschach. She's one of the 4 people in the United States who were known as real Rorschach experts. There was Bruno Klopfer, and Sam Beck, and Marguerite Hertz, and Zygmunt Piotrowski.
Uh-huh.
Those were the 4. Everybody else was a minor light. And she had an office as a consultant at the Cleveland Psychiatric Institute next to mine. And I had learned my Rorschach from a student of Klopfer's. So I did Klopfer. She thought everybody else was no good. And I thought, and she chain smoked. And she had a cigarette, she'd have cigarettes, and the ash would be this long, and she'd never put it out. She'd just let it droop. And so I disliked her. And then one day, in the office next to mine, I heard crying, sobbing, and I went in to see what was wrong, and she was there, and she was in tears. And I asked her what was the matter and what could I help. And it turned out she had a little dog named Peter who had just died.
Oh.
And that put a whole new light on her as far as I was concerned.
Yes.
And we got along quite well after that.
Oh.
But,
Oh, that's a beautiful story.
yeah.
Oh. And how long was she at the Psychiatric Institute?
I don't know. She was there when I got there as a consultant, and I don't know how long she was there afterwards. But she was a consultant at the VA as well.
Oh,
And,
okay.
Dick had her as a student at Case Western Reserve.
Okay.
But I also had the Rorschach with Piotrowski.
Yeah.
And so she and I clashed because I liked his scoring system.
Well, anything other than Hertz was anathema as far as she was concerned. She called Sam Beck a shoe salesman.
Do you remember the story? I vaguely remember this. I think the department chair at Reserve was it Gordon Hall?
Was Albee.
No, before Albee. This guy did a lot of dream research.
Oh. His name escapes me, but
Wasn't Lindsay, but she gave him the Rorschach.
she did.
You remember? And she was at CPI because she had been banned from the psychology department at that point, as I recall, because it was a wonderful, rich Rorschach. But she had to agree not to ever acknowledge whose Rorschach and not to display it. But she thought it was such an interesting Rorschach that she showed it to people as his Rorschach. He was chair of the department. She was suspended.
Gee. Now, who succeeded Albee? Was it Herb Reed?
I don't recall.
Did you know George Albee very, very well while he was
I
there?
didn't know him very
No.
well. I knew him, but I didn't know him very well.
What were your impressions of him?
He had a big ego. I thought he was good for psychology.
Yeah. And it seems that Ohio really has been a place where a lot of significant things for psychology have occurred, and people like George Albee and
The person that I learned my MMPI from was a psychologist by the name of George Guthrie, and he was a roommate in graduate school of Harrison Goff's, who he's a major light in MMPI and developed CPI to begin with.
oh, okay.
And that's who I learned my MMPI from. And then Dave Rogers was a colleague of Goff's, and eventually he and Jim Webb collaborated to develop a little pamphlet, which is probably the best thing that's come out on the MMPI and CPI.
Oh, that's interesting to hear. I certainly appreciated having it when I was in graduate school.
Yeah, did you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Little
That's
yellow
what we
thing,
used.
but it was
Yes.
it's much better than most of the books that have come out since.
That's interesting. I hope I still have it.
We have a copy.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a
Oh, in
copy
your
around here
practice,
somewhere
okay.
too.
That's wonderful.
You know, Jim Webb was with Roche Psychiatric Services and developed their automated MMPI before anybody else did.
I didn't know that.
You didn't know that?
No. Or if I did, I'd
Yeah.
forgotten. But
Yeah, we subscribed to that for some time, and I thought it was spot on. And then PsyCorp and first PsyCorp and now the University of Minnesota have taken over the automated interpretation, and with a lot of input from Butcher and Jack Graham. And I have my own personal feeling about that. They've gotten away from the empiricism of the MMPI, which I thought was one of its strengths, and included a lot of content, which is, in my opinion, a little bit suspect. That's the way the field is going.
that's interesting. That's interesting.
John, you mentioned the chief of psychology at Brecksville, Dewey Jacobs, and when Dewey was at Brecksville in Ohio, he really was pretty much of a force. Maybe you might say a bit about what he was like. And
Well, Dewey was very much involved with APA and with developing the practice standards and the practice. I think he had aspirations of being a bigger force in APA than he turned out to be. But he was always traveling to Washington this and APA that. And he was a champion for psychology at at Brecksville, and eventually when the two hospitals, Brecksville and Cleveland, consolidated, he was appointed chief over both.
Ah.
And I think he was a very strong voice for psychology at the Cleveland VA.
And it sounds like he'd been involved in the VA for a number of years as well
Oh,
as APA.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you have any stories about him that you were thinking of?
Well, no, the classic stories, you alluded to the conflicts between he and the chief of staff. And the one I most remember was by an invitation to a research conference in Washington. It came from the chief of psychiatry. And we were doing a behavior therapy ward, following protocol that came from Washington. And one of my former interns, and who you remember, Dennis Upper, was using the same protocol in Massachusetts, the VA, and several other places. So we were following this. And the chief of staff, for some reason, didn't know what was going on. I mean, he had access to all the information. He found out that it was going on, came on the ward, and ordered it to stop right away. At any rate, when that got to Dewey got on the phone and called the guy in Washington. And there was an explosion, obviously. And later on, when I was getting ready to go to Washington for this conference, we were talking about the results, the chief of staff canceled my trip. So I went down and I told Dr. Jacobs again, well, I guess I can't go. I know I have this invitation from the big chief in Washington, but I can't go. Chief of staff has canceled it. And I remember he almost spit the stem off of the, Mary smoked a pipe. And he said, and then he had this great gleeful look on his face. He got on the phone and it was Marie, I think, his secretary, to get this guy in Washington. So he calls the chief in Washington and explains what took place. And the next thing I know, I'm sitting, there's a conference call with it, and now the chief of staff is on. And Dewey sat there with a big smile on his face. Every once in a while I could hear screams over the phone. For half an hour, the guy from Washington screamed at the chief of staff. And then made him come find me and re-invite me. So
I wasn't there. I don't remember.
that was, and but you know, Dewey had the power to do that. I mean, that's why he was so effective.
Yeah, and he didn't hesitate to go over somebody's head if he thought he was right.
That's great.
And so for all of us young psychologists, we felt very proud to have him as a leader. Now sometimes we would disagree with him, but we knew he would defend us.
Yeah, he might chew you out, but he'd do it in private.
That's right.
He sounds like a great supervisor, a great leader.
Well, and he used to organize these conferences, and very early on he brought in all the big names in behavior therapy for these annual conferences at the hospital. And so he was very, very aggressive in bringing in people with the latest research and practice. So.
Yeah, we participated in some national research projects that were going on in VA, gathering data, and I don't recall exactly what it was that we were doing, but it was, he put us on the map. Brecksville was considered a top-notch hospital in the VA system.
That's wonderful.
And, you know, you were really the kind of the model for a lot of us, the interns. And we used to, from time to time, go to you with MMPIs to see if we could fool you. And most of us, at that time, got our training through your seminars. In fact, I found my notes.
I remember that. That was fun.
Yeah, I found my notes just recently from the seminar series at the hospital.
Wow.
We would play games like, which of these MMPI protocols was a genuine one and which one was a faked one?
Okay.
And
And so Dick, now I understand what you mean by trying to trick him. Okay. Oh, that's great. Well, it certainly sounds like you've had and continue to have a wonderful impact on psychologists. And
yeah. I've had a good career. Psychology has been good to me. And I think I've lived through the growth of psychology
mm-hmm.
in large respects. I remember when I was in graduate school, we learned learning theory was Hullian, Clark Hull, not Skinner yet.
Okay.
Skinner came along a little later.
Yes. Have you been to the museum in Akron, the Psychology Museum?
I haven't been there.
At the
no.
National Archives, I think is what they call
Yeah.
it.
Popplestone developed that, I think.
I'm
John
not sure.
Popplestone.
I don't know.
I think he did.
Oh, yes. Older gentleman. Yeah.
He's either retired or deceased, one of the two.
When they had the ribbon cutting, I think he was there. He and there was a female psychologist had kind of started that, and so one of them were able to be there, and I don't remember if that was him or not, but they certainly talked about him.
Yeah.
So yes, and the Skinner box is there, and they have a number of very interesting the phrenology
Yeah.
helmet and
Brass instruments.
and the Stanford Prison Project video and the Stanford Prison Project video, a number of some of those experiments and things
Yeah.
that
I must go see that. I haven't been there.
well, I appreciate your taking the time to sit with us and
It's been fun.
share your experience. It has been. It has been. Thank you very much.
Good.
I wonder if I know how to turn this off. That's the chair, by the way. It's not me making that noise. Oop.